Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks for coming over this afternoon on the final day of Minds and Money. So apparently uranium was the long-term winner post COP26. So please welcome the panelists to talk about that and how uranium can it be the year for uranium is the question. So please welcome Riaz, Rivzi, he's the Chief Investment Officer from Rice Capital, Daniel Major, Chief Executive Officer from GoviEx Uranium, hand up, John Bay, President and Chief Executive Officer from Standard Uranium, and Robert Crayfourd, Portfolio Manager from CQS. So thanks all very much for coming today. So let's jump straight in. And first question to Riaz. Please tell us, what do you think is behind the recent rise with the uranium price at the moment?
Yeah, uranium has been on a pretty spectacular tear. And I guess it comes down to supply and demand, fundamentally. Structurally speaking, there's been a lot going on behind the scenes over the last few years. We've come out of a 10-year bear market with prices collapsing to $18. And producers finally set up and took note and did something about it. So if you look at the largest producers in the world, they've all cut production significantly. Kazatomprom, the largest producer, has left 100 million pounds in the ground. Cameco more than that. And that really has brought the market back into balance. And then you've got the attractiveness of this asset class, which has driven a lot of capital into the funds that are out there, Yellowcake and Sprott's fund, Sprott. And they've been soaking up a lot of material from the spot market. And that's really sort of driven what we've seen over the last few months, the price rising from $31 to $45 today. So it's been pretty impressive.
And John, with regards to, is nuclear power back? Is that one of the catalysts that can we expect to still drive the price of uranium during the course of next year?
I think most definitely.
Yeah.
When we look at, Riaz mentioned Sprott. Sprott has got their Canadian listing now. They started off with 300 million into it, then they added $1 billion, they added another couple billion, so they're at 3.5 billion, and they haven't got their New York listing, which is expected to come in early next year. When that money starts coming in, the American funds will come in, and we can expect the equities to start rising as well. So that's going to be great for 2022.
That's good news. And Robert, what about the demand-supply issue? Do you think additional uranium supply will come online during the course of next year? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone who would have listened to us speak for the last decade, before it was as fashionable as it has been recently, we would have been sort of talking to this sort of looming deficit that we can all see. We've got the build-out of reactors in Asia. There's a clear deficit coming through. But are we going to see any of that production coming back next year? Well, yes. I mean, there's a couple of those sort of mothball projects or scale back that we've had from the likes of Kazatomprom. It's not clear on the timing of that. So with Kazatomprom, they have stated they're going to bring on a new mine after 2024, which would only be £6.5 million. But that in itself is an indication that they're starting to think about bringing back some of that reduced capacity. Although, from the most recent statements, they're still committed to that, multi-year capacity reduction. And then you have the likes of Cigar Lake, which, in reality, you need Cameco to get enough contracting, long-term contracts to backfill that production from McArthur River, and only then will they, start to get sufficient contracting to justify ever bringing back to backstop Cigar Lake, and then they would have to get more to justify McArthur River.
And Daniel, with regards to the impact that John was talking about with regards to the Sprott uranium trust, etc., what are they trying to? What are their views around that? What do you think they're trying to corner? Are they trying to corner the market? What do you think?
Yeah, I think what they saw was effectively an undervaluation, and I think you got to remember Sprott's also in the equity market as well. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword on the win here. But Sprott, you remember, actually created the original UPC company back in 2004, which actually really helped that whole boom get going. I think what I believe has really Sprott has done, and they really followed on what Cameco was trying to do, in actually buy up spare inventory and take it in. They've just taken that to a new level. They're not the only ones. There's a lot of big funds in there sucking in metal as well. But what they've really done, in my view, is that if you looked at the US utility, if you looked at long-term pricing, we haven't seen a long-term price before this year for 6 years, contract being cut. So a long period of nothing being done. Why? Because the producers wouldn't cut contracts unless they had a 4 written on it. Very hard if you're a utility to go in and say, well, go to your purchasing side and say, well, I actually want to write a contract at 4. And they go, well, what's the long-term contract market? And they go, it's 30. And they go, you ain't doing it. So what it has done is effectively taken that spot price up to a price where the producers are now willing to start signing long-term contracts. So the other thing you have seen is, because of what Riaz is saying, the supply and demand fundamentals are out there, particularly the US utilities, which actually play a lot in the spot market and don't contract a lot, are now starting to worry about where long-term material comes from. So now you're starting to see the utilities actively pushing RFPs out there for long-term material. So we're seeing RFPs coming out from 2025 all the way out to 2033. They came in drips, and that drip is starting to become more drips, and it's starting to become a flow. There was an Asian utility came out with a contract recently all the way out to 2030. For the first 3 years, they put a ceiling price at $55. The years after that were at $78. Pretty well shows you where they think the market's going to go to in the future. So that's what Sprott's really done, in my view, is they've come in and they've moved that price deck up to where the utilities can now negotiate with the producers. Now it's in the hands of the utilities to effectively drive the last piece, which is they need material. Kazatomprom gave a really good chart the other day at the NEI conference, looking at their forecast based on when they listed. Their production collapses after 2031. And the point they're making is we need to bring new projects in, but our new projects are nothing like our old projects. So there is no reliance of new production. You're going to have to move the price higher to get them in.
And nuclear reactors and nuclear facilities are being, well, there's a whole bunch on the books. Look at what's happening in China, for example, and also in France, and even in the UK. John, with political risk, what are your views with regards to some of the recent developments? I think Athabasca Basin has been one example. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, my company, we're Canadian. We actually operate in the Athabasca Basin. So there's been a fair bit of talk recently about issues with First Nations groups who are starting to make a lot of noise about not proper engagement. What the reality is, those First Nations groups, they want mining. They want work being done there. But what they want is meaningful consultation and engagement, and they want to have a bigger piece of the pie. For many years in Saskatchewan, the contracts for the First Nations haven't been great, and they're standing up and saying, okay, we see uranium's on a boom again, let's get engaged, let's be involved, and let's get some meaningful contracts for the First Nations groups. So they're not negative, they're positive, they want mining to happen. So the political risk that's being talked about in the media and with on Twitter, people saying, Canada's not a good place to operate anymore, that's a bunch of rubbish. It's going to be a great place to operate. There's going to be contracts, the mines will get built, and the First Nations are supportive. They just want a good contract.
And just staying on political risk, Riaz, what do you think of your views on political risk with uranium projects in Africa? Obviously totally different to what's happening in Canada with the First Nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge really for a utility, and we saw some very spectacular projects failing in Africa, is to identify where you can get your material from. Most utilities have a very balanced portfolio and recognize that there are inherent benefits and risks to buying from one producer or one part of the world. I think Africa has been fairly consistent in their ability to produce material. Certainly some of the biggest mines in the world, historically, were in Africa, but it's very clear that the geopolitics of energy are really creating concerns in terms of security supply for people. We're seeing control of supply chains, and in Africa, that control is fairly well pronounced in certain geographies, which is leaving, let's say, the countries and the companies that have not been as strategic in the way that they've procured at a disadvantage now.
So Robert, the question to you really, what valuations are you seeing for uranium stocks at the moment? I mean, are they well valued, fair valued? Are you seeing a little bit of a squeeze because of the electricity prices are going to go up, right?
Yeah, so, well, look, it also depends what you think the ultimate uranium price is.
Right.
But, as we look at it today, there's a huge divergence in the ultimate valuation. So, we've seen a lot of retail flow coming into the space, and that's driven up some names far more than it has others, and some have effectively been left behind. So, there's some that look a little rich, and there's some that don't. And that's if you're using a more consensus kind of $60 to $70 type uranium price, which I think we've all got quite clear visibility on, because you're not going to have any material supply added at around those levels. So we have good visibility on that. But, just to put that in perspective, so if we talk to sort of PNAVs, so you can look to Cameco, a kind of round about 1.6, 1.7 PNAV at that level. But obviously, as they then bring back projects, adding more contracting, they get a bit more sensitivity to that. Kazatomprom, somewhat a slight discount to that, so they're probably pricing in something near $62, $63 uranium, which given all of our outlooks on the uranium price shows upside. And then you have the development projects such as NextGen. They're probably trading about 0.7 to 0.8 times PNAV around $50 uranium, but then that quickly falls to about a 0.5 PNAV. As you go up to sort of 70 to 80 type price. But then when you go into the juniors, you get a real divergence, with some names effectively looking quite rich because you don't have clear line of sight into production in the same sense, where others have been completely left behind. So not a uniform answer.
So following on from price, let's talk about investments. Daniel, tell us a little bit more about sort of your uranium investments, just for the audience's benefit, without giving away the full playbook.
Well, my playbook is my company.
Tell us about it.
I gave my presentation, but I want to, rather than talk about GoviEx, because that's not what we're here for. I think a couple of points I would make here. One on valuations. We've seen this in the previous cycle. The different ways of playing this, and the point I would make is that there is a massive premium for companies that can drive through to development. It is a risky business. I mean, that was the point that Kazatomprom were making. You're seeing that with Cameco's book at the moment. They've got two mines, one standing, the other one's. After that, when they shut Cigar Lake in 2030, there's no guarantee of any other projects coming on stream. So one of the problems you've got here is you've got to back the management who can actually put production in. The best example of that would have been in the 2007 cycle, when Paladin managed to, in Africa, put two projects into production. They went from 7 cents to $7. They made a lot of people a lot of money. So it is a really tough industry to get mines away. Permitting risk is a permitting risk. You've recently seen Berkeley in Spain have all of its licenses effectively taken away when they thought they could at least build the mine they had. Now they can build no mine at all. You saw that in Quebec with Matouche. They suddenly became under that issue and shut down as well. They're now back up and running and trying to go somewhere. So I think, you do, when you look at companies, look at the ones that can go through. The exploration plays are a different angle. They're a success find point of view. So I think, that's where you go look. In Africa as well, the other advantage we have is the takeouts tend to happen. If you looked in the last cycle, the three biggest takeouts were all African takeouts. They were all companies that had got to the point of their debt, and they were ready to do it. And one of them was even post-Fukushima, where it was a company with half our pounds in the ground at half our grade, got taken out for $1.2 billion by the Russians. So, there's different ways of playing this story going through.
And Dan, just one more question on this. What are your views on the EU's position with regards to nuclear power?
Well, it's bipolar. Let's start with that comment. No, look. The EU has a struggle and on it, and it is been very much, the nuclear powers versus the anti-nuclear powers. So you've got Spain, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland who are on the antis, are very strong in their position, have been trying to push the EU. And you've got to remember, and I'm no specialist on EU government because it sounds way more complex than anything that anyone could ever imagine creating sensibly. So, you've seen the taxonomy issues. Without science, they put renewables in without even questioning about how it affects But what you have seen in the last couple of years is a steady move through that all of the technical reports have said put nuclear in the taxonomy. I think what you have seen in the last week, though, with the change in government in Germany, is there seems to be a settlement now between Germany and France that nuclear stays in. And I think that's the way it's going. A lot of the pro-nuclear nations have basically said it's the only way. You look at Poland, the Eastern Bloc, the only way they can get clean is nuclear. They say, look, well, we can't build solar panels because it's not sunny all the time here, and we definitely don't have wind. So the only other choice is we've got the transition, which is gas, but we've got to get off that anyway. So
yeah, no, the emissions obviously are minimal. And John, what's the position in Canada with regards to nuclear power and how it's going to help the uranium industry where you're from?
Well, Canada and the U.S. both have very favorable conditions. I mean, the U.S., first of all, has got 95 nuclear reactors, the most in any country in the world, right? They haven't built any. They've got one they're building right now, almost finished, and it's taken them a long time and way over budget. But they haven't built anything for 40 years. So for the U.S., we're going to look to small modular reactors to sort of be the future in the U.S. So right now, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are building a small modular reactor in Wyoming on top of a coal-fired power plant. They're going to prove that out in this decade, and then hopefully they're going to wipe out all those coal-fired power plants across the U.S. That would be remarkable. In Canada, we've got nuclear reactors in Ontario. It's a big part of Ontario's power generation. It's been very successful for many years, and small modular reactors are coming there as well. So they just announced they're going to have the first one in operation by 2028, and that's going to be in Ontario and New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan's even looking at small modular reactors, as is Alberta, who, as you probably know, are the biggest play in the oil industry in Canada, and they're talking about using small modular reactors to help power some of the mining they're doing up there. So it's bright. Nuclear is bright in Canada.
Can I add a comment on this?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so I think COP26 was a really important pivotal point, and I really want to emphasise this, because if you look to the West, you had all of these sort of ageing reactors, and in many countries were looking to sort of wind them down or reduce their capacity ultimately. COP26 has led to a number of governments committing to carbon emissions of zero carbon by 2050 across UK, US, China by 2060. So they've got these agreements, and the reality is they've started to run the maths on renewables, and they realise they're variable and they're having to balance that grid with gas. So the reality is, to try and get anywhere near those targets, which none of them are going to achieve, nuclear and continuing to run those plants in the West is essential. That's just that there is no way, if they can continue to run them, that they can close them. And that's a massive difference, because that affects uranium demand near term. It affects contracting from utilities. Most of the growth has been coming from Asia and the East, primarily China. And then this SMR point is, that's actually, realistically, if the West is going to grow in any material way, it's likely to come from SMRs, which, we're seeing some starting to roll out now in the late 20s, but in reality that will be a 2030 scenario. But it's the quick build time on those, thinking it could be, 2 to 3 years rather than 10 to 15 years, much easier permitting, much more modular design and easy construction. So actually that can have a material impact. But in reality, even without SMRs, there's a clear deficit coming through.
So Riaz, this is a new trend, isn't it? This is a completely new trend that we haven't seen before, in my view. Whether everyone's still raving about COP26, but to get to where we need to get to, we need nuclear power, and therefore it's going to help the uranium industry.
Yeah, unquestionably. I mean, at the moment, to put it into perspective, 60% of electricity generation is still fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Only 11% is nuclear. And so what you're really having to do is replace a lot of very dirty baseload with something which can allow countries and ultimately, all nations around the world to meet their climate obligations. So nuclear is now, I don't think, any more in question in terms of the role that it plays. And the money is also driving investments to ESG-centric themes. And from that respect, the nuclear industry has a really excellent track record of capturing all of its externalities, something that no other industry in power generation does. So I think it's very exciting to see the way that really the winds have turned in support of nuclear. But we really are just at the very beginnings of that. As we mentioned, the taxonomy in Europe is still a discussion. that would be a fundamental change to the way that investors and financing flows into nuclear. China is absolutely behind nuclear with 150 reactors to be built over the next 20 years. But the US, France, pretty much around the world, we're seeing a return to the recognition that nuclear as a reliable baseload, low carbon solution is an integral part. And not to take away from the points made about SMR. SMR is a new technology, but it's a game changer in terms of microgrids and in terms of areas that couldn't afford 1,000 megawatt generation capacity, but you put 120 megawatts and it solves a lot of their problems.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Another point which I think is we have to note here in the UK is Hinkley Point is kind of somewhat notorious for the power price that was required. It was £92 a megawatt hour to justify that. At the time it was pretty in line with where renewables were, but renewables have dropped a lot more. But I think the one thing the UK government is doing a really good job is on realised asset-based pricing, completely restructuring the pricing requirement for nuclear. 60% of that £92 was the finance structuring. It had nothing to do with operating cost, nothing to do with capital. It was risk spreading for the financing to go in. RAB spreads that risk completely through the customers and through the coupon on the investment. They're estimating that will bring it down to £40 to £50. Now that's completely compatible with all the renewables that are out there, so it completely changes it. The other thing that nuclear is doing, which doesn't, that it's starting to talk about, the green hydrogen story. Nuclear has 2/3 of the power from the nuclear power stations wasted. It just goes up in steam. Well, it suits perfectly for creating hydrogen. It's also really good at desalination as well. So nuclear is finding a real way of hybridizing its power usage and basically lowering its cost as well at the same time. So it's not just SMRs, it's not just nuclear demand. They're finding new ways of being part of the total green strategy.
So that's a very good point. I mean, and it goes, just to sort of continue the theme, just a question for all of you actually, and maybe Riaz, you can start us off. What do you think were the main takeaways from COP26 with regards to, because nuclear and uranium doesn't really get a good press, to be fair. Do you think that's opened some doors, and what do you think the takeaways were? Yeah,
I think if we take a step back and look at what happened really till 2012, there was a very, very strong parallel between awareness of climate change and support for nuclear. And then really around 2008, 2009 with global financial crisis, financing these large infrastructure projects became much more difficult. And it's the financing piece, as Daniel was pointing out, which is so critical with these large infrastructure projects. And I think that's one of the takeaways really of COP26. Now COP21 really put our obligations back on the map. And now we're coming back every 5 years to validate the progress and see what needs to be done. And it's clear that not enough is being done. So there's a real sense of urgency. And it's nice to see that once again, nuclear and carbon emissions are really being talked about in the same room, in the same debate.
And Robert, do you think they were just talking the talk rather than walking the walk at COP26? What are your views and the takeaways from that?
Yeah, I mean, to be brutally honest, I mean, you hear a lot of the statements being made, and I'm no huge fan of Greta necessarily, but there is some truth behind it. There's these sort of statements being made about we can go all renewable and this is great, which, it would be great, but they need to solve the battery solution, which, the reality is that technology is not there in sufficient scale. Someone gave me a number, and you haven't confirmed it, but you'd have to have about 160 years worth of current lithium mining to have anything like sufficient to kind of get close to that. I mean, the reality is there's other battery technologies coming through, but they're also not being financed sufficiently. So, it just doesn't form that baseload power. And it's exactly why we're having this energy crisis now. It's because you've got Western governments saying, we hate fossil fuels, no more gas production. They go, so we'll have more renewables. So we've got peaking and troughing pricing, getting more and more extreme in Germany. We've seen as that shifted year by year, it's getting more than 100% more extreme every year as a leader on that. Similar in the likes of California. The only way you balance that is through gas, but then you're cutting gas. So you're just getting this whole situation where policy decisions are being made, but not necessarily by people that understand all the mechanical aspect to that and how the system works.
And John, what are your views? I mean, as a North American, what's your views, and how was COP26 something that was well received? And if so, what do you think the takeaways were from the conference?
Well, from our understanding and from our perspective, looking at what's happening at COP26, just having nuclear talked about more, and what's happening in the nuclear space in the last 18 to 24 months, we're really starting to show up in these talks. People are starting to really reconsider nuclear across the globe, which is fantastic. I mean, nuclear's biggest drawback, in my opinion, is that it's just got a bad reputation, and people just need to be educated on all the benefits of nuclear, the safety of it, the pricing of it, how it can be, the savior for this planet. And so that needs to be, the nuclear industry needs to do a better job marketing, and I see that at COP26 is starting to be talked about. It's potentially being brought into the EU taxonomy now, the ESG investment, which is fantastic. So for the next one out there, hopefully nuclear takes a few more steps forward, and we'll see that as a bigger play in energy systems going forward.
And Daniel, we noticed that China and China and Russia never showed up at the COP26, but did that matter? Or
well, I think for me,
what are your views?
I think the two things came around that time.
Yeah.
One was actually an interesting poll from the US, which was looking at Democrats versus Republicans and their opinions on nuclear. Republicans are always pro-nuclear, but the Democrats have had a massive swing from anti-nuclear to pro-nuclear. But I think the best example of COP26 from a government was actually the UK government, where you looked at the UK government 2 years ago, we're kind of like taking a very capitalist view. It's all be good in the future, guys, don't worry about it. We're going to talk about it, but don't worry about it.
No.
This year, they announced a £221 million investment into Rolls-Royce and SMRs, pushing it forward, and that was matching private money on the other side. Rolls-Royce reckon they'll be in production by 2030 on the back to support that money, and they put $1.7 billion into Sizewell C. EDF made the point that they've coming in on their 5 years. The second reactor came in almost 30% faster than the first reactor going in. The next reactor at Sizewell C will be the same one. So the government's put it, and they've done the ROB financing structure, or they're putting that slowly together as well. So I think that really shows how politics is changing around the world. Just here in the UK, you've gone from, yeah, it's good, we'll talk about it, but now action is actually happening.
And Riaz, we're running out of time slightly, but in terms of how you're seeing administrations and governments putting sort of time limits in terms of, right, everything's got to be decarbonised, or you can't buy a combustible car by 2030, etc. Does that put more pressure on the nuclear power, or actually gives it more airtime, gives it more expression?
I don't think you can electrify transportation, which is 1/3 of all energy consumption, without having reliable baseload power generation that is, CO2 free. So absolutely, that element and legislating around electrification of transportation is a massive impetus for investment in baseload, low carbon solutions. And absolutely right, you can't do it with renewables and battery storage alone. You need a much bigger infrastructural investment. So I think it's very positive.
Great. Well, we've got 20 seconds left, so some final words. John, why don't you just end us and give us on a good note with regards to where uranium's going?
Perfect. So let's say nuclear, we know it's the future. We're really happy with where things are going in 2022. We're seeing so many catalysts, not only on the financial side, but on the mining side and just overall global acceptance. So for us in this industry, it's great to see nuclear starting to shine again, and we're at this nuclear renaissance. So really happy to see that. 2022 is going to be a wonderful year for uranium and nuclear.
Riaz, Daniel, John, and Robert, thank you all very much for today's panel with regards to will 2022 be the year of uranium? Thanks all very much for listening. Thanks.
Thank you very much.